I'd like to continue talking about adaptations due to aerobic training. And we've mentioned already the increase in extraction and the increase in delivery. But what about some biochemical changes? And these biochemical changes are really changes in enzymes or enzyme systems. So we've already talked about or mentioned an increase in the volume of mitochondria in a muscle cell. So that's one major structural change. And this can actually be a twofold increase in the amount or volume of mitochondria in a muscle cell following aerobic training. Pretty amazing. So along with that increase in the volume of mitochondria in a muscle cell, since the mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell and contain the oxidative energy system, then all those enzyme systems found inside the mitochondria are also doubled, are also increased. So there's more citric acid cycle or Krebs cycle. There's a greater amount of electron transport chain. There's a greater amount of the beta oxidation enzymes that will break down fatty acid as a fuel. And there's also a better ability to shuttle NADH electron carrier molecules from outside the mitochondria to inside the mitochondria, where they can drop off their electrons at the electron transport chain. So there's a greater amount of these mitochondrial enzymes. And it's interesting, the current research is that it's a greater amount of mitochondria, not actually better mitochondria, meaning the mitochondria themselves are not more efficient in terms of making oxygen, of using oxygen and making ATP. There's just more of them, maybe twice the amount of them in a muscle cell, in aerobic, probably type 1 muscle cell. So with more of these mitochondria, there'll be a less of a drop in ATP at a given exercise intensity. So almost think of it as a car engine. So here's this car engine that's cruising along and has a big engine. So it can be cruising along at a pretty fast speed and not burning up that much gasoline, that much energy. So here these mitochondria are cruising along and consuming oxygen and making ATP, but at given exercise intensity, there's going to be less of a drop in ATP. So there's less of a drop in ATP at a given exercise intensity. So now I'd like to relate this back to some earlier talks that we had on what regulates glycolysis. So if there's less of a drop in ATP concentration, or officially it's usually like a ratio of ATP to ADP, but we can think of ATP. So remember that these energy systems are trying to make ATP. So now the end product of these energy systems, there's relatively more ATP around in an aerobically trained state versus an untrained state. So if there's more ATP around, this immediate energy system reaction would be slowed down. So there'd be less phosphocreatine depletion because the end product of that energy system is ATP. And so there's relatively more of that. So that's going to go back and inhibit the rate-limiting enzyme of this pathway and slow down this energy system. The same would be true for faster anaerobic glycolysis. You know that the regulatory enzyme, the rate-limiting enzyme of that pathway is PFK, or phosphofructokinase. If there's relatively high amounts of ATP around compared to an untrained state, that's going to go back and inhibit or slow down PFK. So the whole process of fast anaerobic glycolysis would be slowed down. And we know that an end product of faster anaerobic glycolysis is lactic acid, or lactate. So if we've slowed down glycolysis and in a more aerobically trained state, there's going to be less lactate production at a given exercise intensity. And we've seen this graph before, and this graph relates to the accumulation of blood lactate at a given exercise intensity. So on the y-axis is blood lactate, and on the x-axis it's exercise intensity, and here they measure it by oxygen consumption. And so as we're either running or biking harder, lactate stays pretty flat and then it goes up. And we know that the point where it goes up is called the lactate threshold. And this this line would represent a pre-training blood lactate. It accumulates more quickly. In aerobically trained state, we've sort of slowed down glycolysis. So it's still going to accumulate because once we get to such a high exercise intensity, we're going to be cranking out glycolysis. But until then, it's been slowed down. So this line would represent post-training, meaning a person is aerobically trained. Also, training will increase lactate removal. Lactate removal is part of the lactate shuttle, or lactate now that goes out into the bloodstream. Another cell, like a muscle cell, an oxidative muscle cell, a liver cell, a heart cell, can take up that lactate out of the blood and change it back into pyruvate. So it'd be this direction. So lactate would be going back to pyruvate. And then there's energy stored in that 3-carbon lactate to pyruvate. So that pyruvate would then go into the mitochondria and be burned up as an energy source. One other enzyme to be aware of is an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, or HSL. And hormone-sensitive lipase is the enzyme that initiates fat metabolism. And it initiates it by mobilizing the fatty acid out of the fat cell, out of the adipocyte, and to release it out into the bloodstream. And with an increase in removal and a decrease in production of lactic acid, that results in a loss of inhibition, which simply means that hormone-sensitive lipase gets turned on. So if there's less lactic acid around or less acids around, this hormone-sensitive lipase gets turned on. So that's a good thing now. So now what is happening is that hormone-sensitive lipase gets turned on. So with training, there's less lactic acid production, a more constant pH. A more constant pH equals loss of inhibition on hormone-sensitive lipase, meaning now it's turned on. So this results in a greater fat mobilization. It's out into the bloodstream. It gets out into the bloodstream, it gets going, it gets delivered to the working muscles more quickly, a fatty acid like palmitate. It can slow down at the working muscles, so easier for palmitate to be transported into the cell. There's more mitochondria, more beta oxidation enzymes in those mitochondria, or in the muscle cell because of more mitochondria, so greater ability to burn fat as a fuel. So here, and we've talked about this before, following endurance training, there's greater fat utilization at a given submax exercise intensity. So here are the total kcals needed to do some kind of exercise, and it's at different time points. And there's 2 lines on there, and they're right on top of each other. One is before training, one is after training. Here, this middle line is energy from fat. And after training, those lines are always above the before training line. So we're getting more kcals of energy from fat following aerobic training, and we're getting less kcals of energy from carb following aerobic training. So a really nice adaptation with aerobic exercise that results in a change in fuel utilization.